Okay, so I think we've got 6 days left to go of the enforced national mourning before we can start to turn the telly on again and listen to the radio again without wanting to throw either of them across the room or put our foot through them or something. As we are, you know, really subjected to this constant grovelling before somebody who provided the immense service to the ruling class, the immense service of saying absolutely nothing about any of the terrible atrocities that were committed at home and abroad by the state that she is the nominal, by the state that she is the nominal head of. You know, her main achievement seems to have been to be able to live in the lap of luxury, surrounded by the best healthcare, up to the age of 96, without raising a single word against anything that the government did in her name, to give the appearance of being above politics, at the same time as legitimising a racist, class-ridden system that has profited on the backs of slavery and plunder. If you look, for example, at, you know, if you happen to go and queue up and wander past the Queen's coffin while it's lying in state, you will see jewels stolen from various countries around the world. You will see on one of the crowns, for example, the famous, the most valuable diamond in the world, the Caldewll diamond, stolen from India. A country where in 1943 Queen Elizabeth's father presided over the Bengal famine, which directly killed 1.5 million Indians and led to the deaths of 3 million more due to disease. You'll also see items stolen from various parts of Africa, such as Kenya, for example, where in 1952, the year that Queen Elizabeth came to the crown, the Mau Mau uprising took place against British rule, brutally put down, including through the use of torture, through putting rebels in cannons and firing them out of cannons, people, human beings, and so on. We heard not a single word throughout the last 70 years from Queen Elizabeth about the billions made from slavery and empire, no attempt to talk about giving them back and so on. And all of this, of course, that happened abroad was backed up by racism at home. If you look at what happened to the Windrush generation, you know, once the empire had began to crumble and been replaced with the much nicer sounding Commonwealth as a means for the British ruling class to continue and the British business class to continue to exert some influence in the former colonies and so on, who were encouraged to come over to work in Britain after the Second World War, who were met with racism, which continued to this day with the discovery that they didn't have the proper papers with them, and therefore many of them being deported back to countries that they knew nothing about and had never lived in. Not a word from the Queen as the head of state throughout all of this. And of course, as well as the billions stolen from countries around the world in that way, the royal family also own land that has been stolen from people here. They own huge swathes of land, large parts of London. And all of this very valuable property and wealth, by the way, is passed on from generation to generation without them having to pay a penny in inheritance tax, like you or I would when we leave money to our children and so on. Part of the land, I was quite astonished to learn that they own, is something up to 12 miles out from the coast of seabed. How can you own seabed? But apparently the royal family own 12 miles of seabed. And this is fantastically valuable. It's shot up in price. They've made a fortune out of this because its value has increased because of leasing it to wind farm companies. So if you want to know why, you know, it can't be cheaper to produce clean power, you know, maybe we should speak to the environmental friendly King Charles III and say, how about giving this land to be used for free by wind farms and so on. And of course, you know, coming back to the question of the lying in state and the coffin and so on, one of the ways in which this is sold to us as something that we really ought to kind of revere is to raise the idea that what we are looking at is centuries and centuries. Sometimes they say going back thousands of years. You know, think about what was going on 1,000 years ago. You know, this is complete rubbish. about centuries and centuries of tradition, of ceremony. Isn't this part of really something that is so great about Britain? And it's actually quite interesting to look at how the ruling class has really manufactured these traditions quite recently in the history of the royal family, really in the last 150 years or so. Going back before that time, there were long periods where the royal family was very unpopular, where nobody really knew very much about them, cared even less about them, and so on. And the attempts to hold royal pageants in the early part of the 19th century really were enormous flops. So that, for example, in 1852, the Illustrated London News reported that the English are said to be a people who do not understand shows and celebrations, or the proper mode of conducting them. It is alleged that they flock to and applaud the rudest attempts of the kind, and that unlike the French and other nations on the continent, they have no real taste for ceremonial. Contrast that with what we're told, you know, that Britain is so great at doing these great ceremonial processions that represent hundreds and hundreds of years of history and so on. And what actually happened was that this attitude, oh, by the way, I wanted to read a couple of other things about some of the great things, because the early part of the 19th century, a lot of these pageants oscillated between farce and fiasco, just to illustrate it. So in 1817, at the funeral of Prince Charlotte, the daughter of the Prince Regent, the undertakers were drunk. At the George III's coronation. Oh no, hang on, I've forgotten whose one it was. George IV's coronation. They had to employ prize fighters in Westminster Hall to keep the peace between the distinguished but belligerent guests. And at Queen Victoria's coronation, it was completely unrehearsed. The clergy lost their place in the order of service. The choir was pitifully inadequate. The Archbishop of Canterbury put the ring on a finger that was too big for it. And two of the train bearers talked throughout the entire ceremony. So, you know, really the idea that there are these big traditions going back hundreds of years, carefully planned and so on, is actually a load of rubbish. But what actually happened towards the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century in the run-up to the First World War, of course, was that Britain was going through a stage of immense change, immense social change and upheaval. So becoming a primarily industrial country, and the growth of the working class and class struggles starting to break out. What was called the new unionism of workers in organisations like the dockers beginning to get organised, the gas workers and so on, that was starting to happen. And against that background, there was a big pressure on Queen Victoria, who had effectively retired from public life following the death of her husband and refused to take part in anything, to really come out and take part in a big ceremonial, which eventually they persuaded her to do for her Golden Jubilee in 1889, which was such a success that they repeated it 10 years later for the Diamond Jubilee in 1899. So these were really invented traditions. These were made up things specifically for a purpose. So all sorts of things, like the type of uniforms that people wear, the sort of candles that they put in the churches and so on, all of these things were invented around that time. And there was a reason why that happened. You know, it happened because of this great period of social change that was going through, and that people couldn't see the monarch, the head of state, and so on, and what was going to kind of bring some stability into society. And therefore, the idea that we should have these great pageants for people really took off, and they actually fought to persuade that to happen. So this is this is from a really good book, by the way, called The Invention of Tradition, and they're talking about this whole period, and they say, in such an age of change, crisis and dislocation, the preservation of anachronism, the deliberate ceremonial presentation of an impotent but venerated monarch. Very important that she was impotent, by the way, that she wasn't actually playing an active part in politics, so it was safe to bring her back as a figurehead. She wasn't going to interfere. She was going to give this appearance of somehow being above politics, but as the head of a nation. an impotent but venerated monarch as a unifying symbol of permanence and national community became both possible and necessary. And one of the journalists, a supporter of the government, writing at the time, said the more democratic we get, in other words, the more the masses come into the stage of history, the more we shall get to like state and show, which have ever pleased the vulgar. You can see what he thinks of the masses coming into the stage and what he thought the role was. And therefore, you had this attempt to promote the monarch as the head of state, as a kind of stabilising factor in a time of great change and crisis for the ruling class and so on. And what it did was both provide that stability and also at the same time legitimise class rule. As the Archbishop of Canterbury said after the Golden Jubilee, days afterwards, everyone feels the socialist movement has had a check. So just for a while, we put the class struggle on hold, and we all got behind the royal family. So that's the origins of the traditions that you see today, and that is why I think Socialist Worker is quite right to have the headline on the paper this week of abolishing the monarchy, because that attempt to unite everybody behind this figurehead, supposedly above politics, but at the same time legitimising class rule and the deep class divisions within society, because of course the flip side of the idea that there are these people at the top of society that we all need to show great reverence to is that the rest of us really have to put on with much worse standards of living. And in promoting this idea of the monarchy as the head of state, above politics, working for us and so on, they were aided in no small part by the press of the day, whereas as you started to come into circulation, mass circulation, newspapers and so on, which as they do today, were constantly obsequious to the royal family, didn't print any criticisms of the royal family. A lot of people have been noting now, haven't they, that if you want to read any criticism of the royal family, you have to read the foreign papers, not the English papers, where you might get arrested even for heckling the person included with sex trafficking, Prince Andrew and so on. So the press and later the radio and television, the BBC, the fact that they even employ a royal correspondent, they specifically employ somebody whose job it is to sell the royal family to us. They slavishly promoted this idea of the national interest, that everything the monarch does is for the good of the nation, and that what's good for the nation must be good for all of us. I mean, of course, closing food banks on Monday for the Queen's funeral is going to be good for everybody, isn't it? I mean, what a horrific comment on the way that they really view poor people in society. But you can see why the ruling class want to promote that idea, this idea that there is some kind of national interest which the ruling class, which the royal family represent, and which we all need to pull together in times of crisis and so on. You can see why that is an important idea to the ruling class, can't you? Because we're in the middle of a massive cost of living crisis. People are worrying about how they're going to pay the bills, put food on the table, pay the rent and so on. And at the same time, you're seeing the working class begin to flex its muscles. You've seen the strikes in the Royal Mail, on the trains, and so on, the big rallies around enough is enough and so on, people beginning to fight back. We're also in the middle of a massive environmental crisis where all but the most die-hard climate deniers really are having to accept that we are really in a very serious situation, but the ruling class have no solution really other than to continue to help the fossil fuel companies to make profits, even going back to nuclear power and bringing back fracking and so on. And at the same time, most of the institutions that are usually looked to hold society together are starting to crack. The police, for example, it wasn't, people will remember from the case of Sarah Everard, murdered by a policeman, and then people at the vigil for her attacked and arrested by the police and so on. And of course, people may have seen last weekend the fantastic protests for against the murder by a policeman of the unarmed black man, Chris Cabber and so on. So the police really, people losing trust in Parliament, I mean, it wasn't that long ago, was it, when actually Boris Johnson had to go because of the disgust, really, at the way that he treated ordinary people, that the parties that went on in Parliament where people were dying of COVID, the contracts that were handed out to their mates who didn't deliver, and so on and so forth. So again, an institution in which lots of people are starting to lose faith, even the royal family actually, until recently. You know, the scandal around Prince Andrew, and people might remember it wasn't very long ago that Prince Edward was booed by Liverpool football supporters, was it? You know, because people remember the role that the state played around Hillsborough when Liverpool supporters were killed in a crush and so on. And now, of course, they've got the minute's silence for the Queen, and you know, when Liverpool played their European game yesterday, and so on. So, all of these things are really, it's like the lid was being lifted off society, and you'll begin to see underneath the horrible, rotten class nature, of society, because the reality is that the ruling class and the working class will never have the same interests. To put it bluntly, they make their profits by exploiting us. There is no way that they can continue to make their profits without continuing to exploit us. So we cannot have the same. We cannot have the same interests, and they are attempting to use the funeral to get us all to come together and celebrate someone who gave everything for the nation, which is not, of course, is not true. She gave it for herself and for her family and for her class. And we need to break from the idea that there's a national interest. And instead insert the interests of our class, which is international, by the way. Our solidarity is with the victims of the British Empire, some of whose effects are felt to this day, the people rebelling in Sudan, the people rebelling in Palestine. These are the people that we are showing solidarity with. And that's why it's a massive mistake to have called off the strikes that were going to take place this weekend, particularly Mick Lynch, who says that he's a great fan of James Connolly, you know, the Irish rebel and socialist, who would be spitting in his grave at the idea that you should call off a strike in order to show respect to a member of the monarchy. We are in the middle of crucial class battles, and their side isn't stopping, is it? The polyfloor strikers that we heard last week, their bosses haven't said, "Oh no, we're going to open the factory and pay you for the day" on the Queen. No, they're still locking them out. Clarence House, you know, because Prince Charles is going to move from Clarence House. So what's he done in the middle of the lying in state ceremony? What's he done? He's issued redundancy notices to 100 staff and so on. Even Extinction Rebellion have called off their protest. And so on. And I think this is a big mistake. I think it's showing a level of cowardice on our side as we're being battered into submission before the immense wealth and cruelty that the royal family represents. And of course, a lot of people will say, well, it's not me really, I don't really agree with it, I don't really like the royal family, but it's public opinion, so you've got to do it. I think there's a number of questions about that. People might want to talk about it in the discussion. First of all, there's a large section not going along with it, actually. It might be a minority, but there was quite a large minority not going on with it. A lot of black and brown people, a lot of people who protested over the death of Chris Cabba, good for them, and there's going to be a National Day of Action on Saturday. A lot of younger people. There's actually quite a large minority that don't agree with all of this stuff, and I think an even bigger minority that think they've gone too far. You know, you can't ride stop bicycles on the day, and all this, you know, arresting people with placards and so on. Secondly, the strikes were very, very popular, and some strikes that did actually carry on. You know, the AQA strikers that we also heard last week did go ahead with their strike. They decided not to pick it, but at least they kept on with their strike. And thirdly, as I've already mentioned with the press, public opinion is manipulated by the media, but it's not what wins strikes. And actually, when we fight confidently, our side can pull people with us, but if we back down, they win. The problem is that the trade union leaders don't have confidence in ordinary workers to fight and to stand up to the media. For all their fighting talk, they're desperate to be seen as reasonable, and they're negotiators and compromisers, and historically have always faltered when presented with a clash between class and nation. And the Labour Party is exactly the same. The Labour Party was in fact set up to represent the interests of the trade union leaders in Parliament on the back of the defeat of the great struggles of new unionism, by the way. Oh, we're not going to win through strikes and so on, so we need somebody to represent us in Parliament. The Labour Party was founded on the contradiction between class and nation, to represent the working class, but to do so within the institutions of a national state and a national capitalist economy managed by a capitalist parliament. Robert Blatchford, at the founding of the Independent Labour Party, one of the forerunners of the Labour Party, said we were British first and socialists second. And it's easy to see, isn't it, if you think about what's happened just recently with the calling off of strikes, how easily the big socialist Labour parties in 1914 all collapsed in support of the First World War. All of them up to the day of some of the big votes in their parliaments and said, no, we're internationalists, we stand for peace and so on. When it came to it, they all caved into the pressure. You think about one death of a queen at age 96, which, you know, she was going to die, you know what I mean? It wasn't a big surprise, and the strikes get called off. Imagine the pressure that comes with the call to war, and they all collapse with a few honourable exceptions. The Bolsheviks in Russia, people like Karl Liebknecht in Germany, and so on. And of course that is continuing to this day. If you look at Keir Starmer, I can't find my phone anyway, I think I'm running out of time, so I might not directly read the quote, but there's so many horrible quotes from Keir Starmer about this, but in one of them he talks about how, you know, the Queen, blah, 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 and we've all got to, she would want us all to pull together to face the storm. Well, I'm sorry, but some of us have to face the storm in little inflatable dinghies coming across the channel. Some of us can face the storm from any one of our many luxury yachts that we happen to own, and not only that, but when it comes to the great the great storms to come and the difficult decisions facing us. For some, it's a choice between heating and eating. For some, it's which of the many houses that are paid for by the public, how much should I live in, and so on. Now, of course, when it comes to these things, there is a difference between the right and the left in the Labour Party, but both are hampered by the fact that class differences cannot be reconciled with national unity. For the right, they would put the emphasis on the nation, that what's good for the nation is good for the workers. They're quite, unashamed nationalists, always undermining class struggle and so on. But even for the left, who will put the emphasis on the workers' side, they will put it the other way around, if you like. What's good for the workers is also good for the nation. Some kind of plea to the bosses, to the managers of capitalism. But if only we could run capitalism so that it was a bit nicer, so that workers got a little bit more. Actually, that would be good for everybody. But this is presenting the problem not as one of how capitalism is managed, when actually the problem is capitalism itself. And that just brings me to the final point, really, which is about the revolutionary alternative. Because to consistently promote the interests of the working class, we have to break from the idea of national interest and see how the state and all of its institutions, the parliament, the police, the army, the courts, the civil service, the media, even softer arms of the state like education. I was quite annoyed that my 8-year-old granddaughter had lessons about the Queen and assemblies about the Queen and so on. How all of these institutions operate in the interest of the ruling class and need to be replaced. The state needs to be replaced in its entirety by a state run by and for workers. The people who produce the goods and services upon which our quality of life depends. We need our own state run in our interests, and we need to break with the sort of people that represent that state, especially monarchs. I mean, you know, we can talk about breaking with parliamentary democracy. That might be a harder argument, but surely these unelected parasites, do you know what I mean? We can at least get rid of them. And that is why for us in the Socialist Workers' Party, the self-activity of workers, strikes, demonstrations, developing rank and file control of the struggle through strike committees and so on that begin to challenge the union and labour leaders is crucial to our vision of resistance. So we think that now is the time to step up that resistance, not back down. The Tories are weak, the death of the Queen has helped them out a little bit actually. In the long run, however, their problems are still there, and I think they're going to have a big problem trying to sell Charles to most people. I mean, he is a rather blatantly obnoxious man, and he gets so angry with fountain pens and inkwells. I mean, what's he going to do when his subjects start getting a little bit uppity and so on? So we've lost a bit of momentum, but I think we need to continue to fight. I was going to finish with a couple of quotes, but I can see the chair getting anxious, so I'm just going to stop there. Thanks.